You know, I told myself I was gonna shave before this video, and I just decided let's just embrace the chaos. Texas, uh, I never want to see that happen again. It was terrible. Welcome to the IndyCar Red Pill, the show where we talk about IndyCar racing, no punches pulled and no filter. And if you haven't already turned off based on my statement I just made, let me just throw out some disclaimers really quick. No, I don't hate oval racing. No, I don't want oval racing to go away. No, I don't hate close racing. And no, I don't hate high-speed racing on banked tracks. Don't hate any of that. What I do hate is seeing cars packed together constantly, lap after lap, and yet you still have the same guy lead 180 laps of the race, two massive accidents where luckily, thankfully, we did not see anybody get hurt. But outside of that, boy, was this race a shambles. Just almost from lap one. Obviously, a lot of what we saw had to do with the fact that the Texas Motor Speedway was repaved and reconfigured. So essentially, it was a different track than what we saw last year. And pretty much everybody dropped the ball. That includes IndyCar, that includes the drivers, that includes even Firestone, who is usually pretty bulletproof, but this time they didn't do such a good job. I'm going to try to keep this fairly short because I've got better things to do than get angry at a race that will probably never happen again in the way that it happened. But I'd just like to point out a few things, a few grievances of problems I had with this race. First off, of course, is the standard of driving that we saw. We didn't see a whole lot of respect out of a lot of the drivers. One in particular, who's you wouldn't have expected going in, and he's since admitted his mistakes. So we won't go too hard on him, but ultimately, Tony Kanaan left about 9 or 10 cars smoldering behind him throughout the day. Not too good. We also saw, ironically, Scott Dixon. He made a move on Alexander Rossi, which ended up causing an accident. We also saw Takuma Sato, the current reigning Indy 500 champion, make a similar move on Dixon. We saw Joseph Newgarden make an ill-advised 3-wide pass, which ended up putting him in the wall. We saw Gabby Chavez and Graham Rahal chop each other's noses off at least a couple times. So we saw a lot of driving where it was just very crazy. And I think, again, this is going to come back to another point that I'm going to talk about later is, when you get the style of pack racing in Indy cars in particular that you see at a Talladega or a Daytona in NASCAR, you're going to get the overambitious folks who generally don't run up at the front at every race or any race, in the case of a few people. They'll get up in that lead pack and they'll really go for it, and that's where you get a lot of trouble starting. And that's just kind of one of my complaints about that style of racing that we saw, the 2x2 cars locked together, because ultimately, when somebody decides to get crazy, you don't have anywhere to go. It's not like you can just back out of the throttle, jam on the brakes in the middle of the pack, or you'll get what you saw during the big one. I hate to say that describing an IndyCar race, but during the big one, you saw a crash that was maybe going to take 3 or 4 cars, turned into about 8 or 9 because a lot of guys were slamming on the brakes and were getting piled into. Just a really unfortunate scenario, and like I said, the driving certainly wasn't up to the general standards that you would hold IndyCar drivers to, but there was a lot more factors at play, of course. Like I said, the reconfiguring of the track, it's unfortunate because I think the Texas race last year was maybe one of the best ones that Texas Motor Speedway has ever put on. The cars were packed together, but there was separation at the same time. There were multiple grooves of racing. I would say the new Texas Motor Speedway has about 2.5 grooves, and that's about it, versus the 4 grooves we saw being used in last year's race. And I think that contributed a lot to the bottlenecking and a lot of the contact wheel-to-wheel silliness that we saw. We also saw people taken to the grass. Well, that was obviously like Sato and Max Chilton a few laps earlier than him. The reason we saw that was because people were so desperate to get to the inside, they were trying to stick noses in underneath, trying to get to kind of catch someone sleeping and try to get to that inside, because that was really the only, I mean, there's really was one good lane. There was 2 lanes pretty much people could run in, but there was one good lane, and that was the bottom lane, which we saw Will Power use for the majority of the race, just hugging the bottom. Sometimes he had Simon Pagenaud kind of run a half lane up to kind of keep a second lane from forming. That was a good NASCAR-style strategy by Team Penske, but ultimately it led to a guy leading the 2/3 of the race. And I always hear from the people who advocate for pack racing is that, oh, well, this is more competitive. There are more people who can lead. I didn't see that. Unlike Fontana 2015 or Texas last year, in which you had cars running very close together, this time there was no real chance of making a pass using bravery and or a superior car to get around. Once a person who had a decent car got into the lead, they were pretty much stuck there as long as they held the bottom, which obviously you saw experienced guys like Will Power able to do that, and then when a guy like Max Chilton, who once again kind of showed his inexperience on the ovals, did not hold the bottom as well and got passed by Power. You know, once you get somebody on that bottom, they're never going to heed the bottom, and you're going to get a pretty boring race. I mean, this is the stuff we saw, and I say boring in that it may have been very thrilling from about 3rd place on back with all the people jockeying for position, trying to get kind of up to 2nd. I don't know. It was tough. I mean, it was a race that I made this comparison on Twitter. It was a race like Talladega, and I hate to make that comparison because it's unfortunate that some people want to see racing like that and want that every week, because honestly, Talladega-style racing is really just, let's wait around for the big one all day. And when it happens, then maybe we'll get a close finish. But more than likely, there's going to be a wreck right before the end. And guess what race we got? Newsflash, we got a wreck right at the end. You know, and especially because of the fact that, you know, IndyCar is not in as good a financial position as NASCAR is to do that. You know, and also the cars cost more. I mean, Robin Miller did some pretty excellent reporting in that he totaled the crash damage bill to $1.8 million. You could buy, you know, almost 3 brand new, maybe 4 brand new Dallara chassis for that. And that's not counting the aero kit bits. That's not counting, you know, even possibly the damage to human life. I mean, I can't even tell you how insanely lucky we were that there wasn't somebody who got hurt at Texas. Because and again, this is not me saying I hate Texas. This is not me saying I hate ovals. And I do understand more than a lot of people, and I advocate for it, is that, like, racing is dangerous. I get that. The idea is to not take stupid risks where you put drivers in positions where you see them going absolutely nuts trying to race for 3rd place. I mean, it's just silly when you see, you know, what we saw, especially, you know, that what started the big one was, what, a race for 2nd, 3rd place? Not even, I think maybe just at the halfway mark of the race. It was silly, and we haven't even gotten into one of my biggest grievances with the whole thing was IndyCar's handling of the Firestone screw-up. Now, as we know, Firestone, I mean, this is maybe the first time I can think of a complete across-the-board failure by Firestone, at least in the era where they've had sole tire supply. So since 1999, when Goodyear left, pretty much all motorsports except for NHRA and NASCAR. This is the first time we've really seen a major Firestone failure in that their tires didn't last. Now, IndyCar's solution to this was, as the broadcast coined, competition cautions. Oh boy, competition cautions. The people who say the competition cautions were a safety measure, no, and I'll tell you why. The competition cautions. Let me put it this way. Instead of competition cautions, what they should have done is have mandatory pit stops like they did every 30 laps to change the tires. Where they made a mistake was going with the mandatory pit stops because, of course, the mandatory pit stops, or excuse me, not mandatory pit stops, mandatory yellow. When they went with the mandatory yellow, they did two things, and both of which contributed to a lot of silliness by the drivers. Obviously, this is another complaint I have at NASCAR stage racing, to be perfectly honest with you, because it goes into the same thing. When you have predictable cautions in a race, when you have moments that drivers know on lap 170 there's going to be a yellow, and on lap 200 there's going to be another one, because we've got to go 30 lap intervals between tire changes, and the series is going to bring out a yellow. Guess what they're going to do? They're going to drive really, really hard and really, really stupid just before the yellow and just after the yellow, because those are the best times to make up positions. And what we saw was exactly what most of the time we see in NASCAR stage racing, is that we get a lot of wrecks right before the competition caution and right after the competition caution, because you pack everybody up and you have stopped the race. And what happens to racing drivers when you stop races generally is they get crazy, because racing drivers don't like to not race. And that was really unfortunate, because ultimately IndyCar, in trying to make a safety decision, I would argue actually made a decision that made the race more dangerous, because they kept the cars packed together. Had they had mandatory green flag pit stops, it would have spread the field out a little bit, and would have allowed maybe the race to play out in a more natural way. You maybe wouldn't have had the 200-mile-an-hour pace lap at the end of the race, which ultimately ended the race because of drivers getting crazy. Another grievance I have to make, since I've talked about the mandatory cautions, was the fact that IndyCar made a great decision by penalizing Tony Kanaan, rightly so, for causing the massive accident in the middle of the race. The only problem was IndyCar has what is essentially a lucky dog rule, aka the wave around rule, which in what it means is it's actually worse. This is the crazy thing. It's the IndyCar wave around rule is actually worse than NASCAR's lucky dog rule in terms of giving free positions on the track to people. How is that possible? How can IndyCar be less legitimate in terms of giving lap cars their laps back than NASCAR? Well, let me tell you, it's because they let people pit. They let the lap cars they give the wave around to pit under the yellow. So essentially, they make up a full lap plus gain a pit stop. Guess how Tony Kanaan got to second place? He made up 3 laps on the 3 competition yellows. Absolutely unacceptable. Absolutely unacceptable. It completely nullified the penalty that was given, rightfully so, to a driver that crashed 8 cars. Ridiculous. Ridiculous. And I've said this for a long time about IndyCar, is that they need to get rid of this wave around rule. I get it. People think, and this is another thing I was getting at Detroit too, is that people think that lap cars not being in the way, and lap cars, oh, get the lap cars out of the way. It's not, it's changing my racing, so it's not exciting. Ridiculous. People who lap cars have gained that advantage You shouldn't move them to the back. You shouldn't move them out of the way. The lap cars fall where they fall on the yellows. And that's the way it should be. Because you have the cars that are laps down are not there because they don't deserve to be a lap down. They did something or had something go wrong that put them a lap down. It's not a legitimate competition as far as I'm concerned when you give those lap cars the positions back. It's ridiculous. Especially when you're going to fabricate cautions, you're going to bring out legitimate or illegitimate cautions because your tire manufacturer screwed up. This race was such a failure in so many ways by IndyCar. But at the same time, I'm hopeful for the future in terms of this because I think in a lot of ways, especially the crash bill, the $1.8 million, and when you think about the TV rating was a 0.3, there's no return on investment there. You will see the cars spread out a little bit more next year. I hope it's not too spread out because, like I said, I like oval racing. I like close-fought, competitive oval racing. What I don't like is seeing drivers, cars, and teams put in positions where they are artificially stuck together in a gigantic group the entire race, and the best car, driver, and team are not able to prove that they can win the race. It's down to chance. It's down to whether or not you get taken out. It's down to a lot of factors that really shouldn't determine races. I think the smartest thing IndyCar did at the end of this race, and I know this one's going to get me hate because of how Detroit went, but the smartest thing they could have possibly done is not throw the red flag at the end of the race to get a green flag finish, because I almost have no doubt that somebody would have gotten hurt if they had green-white checkered it. That was smart. That was one of the things I was worried about in Detroit, was that it set a dangerous precedent in that, doing green-white checkers on ovals is dangerous enough in NASCAR. There's the reason they have the overtime line now. It's not because they're trying to get a better finish. It's because they know they dodged a few bullets, especially on the plate tracks the last couple of years. IndyCar was smart not to do that, because the last thing IndyCar needs at the moment is a fatality, similar to what happened to Dan Weldon. Let's be honest. I mean, they had a fatality a couple years ago with Wilson, but I think that ultimately was a freak accident. I know people will argue closed cockpits and whatnot, but if they lose a driver in a crash where in a similar situation, not completely the same, obviously, as Las Vegas, but in a similar situation to Las Vegas, that's not a good look. That's not a good look. So I'm glad it ended the way it did. I'm glad everybody lived to tell the tale. I'm hoping, I like to see that small rear wing on that 2018 car. I know I just went on the Indy Sports Car podcast and defended my position that I'm not a big fan of the fact that the aero kits are gone next year. But seeing that small rear wing on that new car, or new chassis, or not new chassis, new body kit, gives me some hope that we're going to see some lower downforce racing, hopefully a little bit more spread out, more like the Michigan races in the kart era, more like the Fontana races we saw in the DW12 era, and less like the pack races we saw at Las Vegas 2011 or Texas 2000. Now, I do understand the people who like the plate races, or not plate races, the pack races. When I was a kid, I saw the 2000 Texas race, the spring 2000 Texas race, because they actually used to race at Texas twice a year, believe it or not. But and it was fantastic. I thought it was the best racing I'd ever seen. And it was that. I understand the people who like it, and I understand especially if the kids like it, because they don't understand what can happen yet. And it's unfortunate when you get the wake-up call, because my wake-up call was, ironically, Texas 2003, when I saw a car literally get shredded, and I had never seen destruction like that before. And as a kid, that wakes you up. Again, a lucky situation with Kenny Breck in that situation that he was not killed, but you think that you literally just saw somebody lose their life in like the most horrific way possible, and it definitely changes your attitude. But again, I'm an oval fan. I like ovals. I think they should absolutely always be a part of IndyCar outside of the Indianapolis 500. I would buy tickets to Michigan day one if they brought it back, but that'll never happen because of Detroit. Thanks, Roger. But yeah, so that's kind of a serious and somber IndyCar red pill. Road America's next, 2 weeks from now. So hopefully we'll have something positive to talk about. I think Road America was one of the best races of last year. Outside of Texas, ironically enough. This year, Texas was not one of the best races. So thank you guys so much for watching. Obviously, you probably will disagree with me on at least one of my points, so down in the comments. Have at it, boys. Have at it, boys. We've had every other NASCAR possible reference in this video, so have at it, boys, in the comments. It'll be a fun discussion. I'm tired. I'm worn out from thinking about Texas way too long. Glad everybody's safe, and we'll see you in the next video.